Hello and welcome. Tonight I thought we would take a look at this website called Liminal Earth. It's a website where people submit their paranormal experiences or strange activity with the location where it happened, and then they put the stories on the map. So let me read this little blurb here down at the bottom of the page. Is there a specific place where you've seen fairies, ghosts, Bigfoot, time travelers, extraterrestrials, ultra-terrestrials? Never heard of those. Crow conferences, sentient lawn computers, lanyard ogres, broccoli wizards, etc. Alright, they're getting a little quirky on us. Does your town have an urban legend you'd love to get to the bottom of? Send us your story and we might include it on our map. Okay, so that's the general idea. You can either browse around on the map. Looks like most of the experiences are in North America, but there are some scattered all over the world. There appear to be some in the middle of the ocean. We have a Lovecraftian monster. Okay. And they have this legend here, which has a handful of different categories. We have classic UFO, cryptoids, dark forces, high weirdness, mythologies, randonaut find, which I would think is a Randonautica find. If you're not familiar with that, it's an app on your phone. It generates random coordinates, and you go there if you want. And the idea is to find something weird. So I guess these are successful Randonautica finds. We got straight up ghosts, strange animals, thin places, time distortions, and visions. So, what I think we're going to do tonight is scroll through the stories, and I'll pick out some interesting ones that I find, and we'll read them and maybe just have a little commentary on them. This is kind of more of a casual version of another video I do. Well, it's more of a podcast. But it's called Ghosts with Goblin, and what I do on that is I pick stories from this awesome website called Your Ghost Stories, where people post their paranormal experiences, and I find interesting ones, and I usually pick a theme, and we'll read stories, and then I'll go really in-depth on relevant folklore, science, different stuff like that. Tonight, I don't think we'll get into any super deep dives. I think we'll just go casual, but who knows? We'll see. I haven't really looked on this website that much. So, that sounds good. Let's get to it. I think we're going to read Thin Places. Places where the veil is thin. Okay, so first one I found is Mysterious Vanishing Black Car. And this one is from West Virginia. Oh, Point Pleasant, West Virginia. If you're not familiar, that's where the famous or infamous Mothman is from. And immediately when I see the name of this story, it makes me think of this really cool urban legend called the Black Volga. And I think it's mostly a European folktale, if I'm not mistaken. Let's take a quick peek. So yeah, it's a Polish, Romanian, Hungarian, Russian, Eastern European urban legend. And it's this black car. It's the type of car. It's called a Volga. But basically, the urban legend is if you see this black Volga driving down the road, probably a lonely road, They may abduct people. You might see someone strange driving the car. Satan, perhaps. Nuns, I've heard. And there is a pretty cool movie starring Ray Wise that kind of plays on that legend a little bit. It's called Dead End. It's pretty cool. Anyway, let's read this one. As I was driving through the former TNT area, I know a little bit about Point Pleasant. I think there was a big TNT factory that's pretty famous to the area, and I think it's also relevant to the Mothman legends, but I don't know much beyond that. As I was driving through the former TNT area, I noticed a black car following me. I was taking my time, so I pulled off to let them pass. A few miles down the narrow gravel road, the car went over a rise. As I followed the car over the rise, I realized that, quite suddenly, the car was no longer there. There was nowhere it could have turned off, and the road wasn't in good enough condition for it to have sped up enough to be out of sight. I realized that I might have had an overactive imagination. Black sedan, right in the Mothman region. But I had never had anything like that happen before or since. A simple story, but I have always found ghost cars or vanishing cars really intriguing for some reason. Looks like this area might be in some mountains too. I don't know. Oh, maybe we can drop. Oh, here's where we were. Wow, okay, so this is a very lonely road. Awesome. I feel like because me and my friends, we used to, when you first start driving, that's all you want to do. So we would go and drive, 20 minutes out to the country and drive on the back roads. And sometimes I would go alone too. I do remember having this happen to me one time. I, saw another car. I think that it was behind me. And I went over the hill and I was expecting it to reappear, behind me over the hill, and it never did. It's very possible that it could have turned or something while I was, before I reached the top of the hill. Who knows? And this is a story that I'm sure something similar could happen. But nonetheless, I find, I don't know, for some reason I find the vanishing cars very interesting. And this looks like it could be a very creepy road at night. I mean, it looks like it's almost one lane. Okay, anyway, let's move on. Let's read this one next. It's called Dream House, and it takes place in France. I often dream of that place. I lived there for about 15 years. I know every little detail around, but the weirdest one is a house that only exists in my dreams. Every time I dream of this place I used to live in, there is this additional house down the road. It is supposed to be the house of an elderly person who's either rarely there or rarely outside. The house is small and its shape is unusual, often very ominous and guarded by a small yet rabid dog. The last encounter had a few differences. The most peculiar one is that once you're in front of the house, you'll see a few rows of new houses behind it instead of the woods. After that, the dream shifted to another house up the road. This one does physically exist, although in the dream, the interior was bigger and very impressive. The conclusion is that the mystery house is a mix of multiple existing houses around the village that merged into a new twisted house made of ambiguous energy due to the radical differences between the inhabitants and the backstories of their houses. So this one's interesting because it's not a real place, but it is a real place. I mean, technically our dreams are thin places. We are between worlds. Okay, I want to mention something about the map. So first of all, looks like nearby we have some high weirdness. So this is an active spot right here, it seems. And then also, when I went to drop us down to get a little scenic view during the story. Didn't look like there was anywhere to drop down, very near to where our story took place, so I dropped us down over here. But I was messing around with the map, and I just thought I would try and drop it down right on the area. And look at this. Nothing happens when I do it here in full screen, but look what happens when... Just look at this. I drop it down and we are in a building. What is this building? Are we in the dream house? It looks like it's a church. Look at this. Isn't that cool? Okay, so we're gonna take a walk around the dream house while we reflect on this story a little bit. So I of course am fascinated by dreams, and I mean, this is kind of common, right? There are familiar locations in your dreams, and sometimes you even know that it's the place, I know this is my childhood home, but it looks nothing like it. But I know that's where I am. You know what I mean? Or maybe you are in a home, but it looks slightly different. Yeah, I'm sure this is a very common experience. I also think is fascinating is recurring locations in dreams. I don't know if any of you have experienced this. I'm sure you have. I definitely have. There's a couple places in my dreams, and if I start dreaming and then I realize where I am, I'm like, oh, of course, I'm at this place. And it's kind of lucid, although I don't really know. I don't know if I'm exactly aware that I'm dreaming, but I'm aware of this is a familiar place. It's so interesting how we have like this mythos, a subconscious mythos, like that they know these details about this not real place. It's so interesting to me. Okay, I found out that this church is called the Chapel St. Adrian, and I couldn't find anything about it in English, but apparently it has this fountain here, which is of some importance. Pretty interesting that we stumbled upon it. The next story we're going to read is called Farm Goblins, and it takes place in Illinois. Now, right off the bat, the title of this story reminds me of a topic that I actually discussed recently in my podcast that I mentioned earlier. I did an episode on goblins recently, and we discussed a famous UFO case called the Hopkinsville Goblins. It took place on a farm in Kentucky. It's very, very interesting. So if you want to know more about that, you can listen to that episode or just look up the Hopkinsville Goblins. But let's read Farm Goblins now, and I will drop us down. I'm getting the hang of things now. I'll drop us down and I'll let you guys explore a little bit while I read the story. The date given for this story is 1989 to 1993. I grew up in a 2-story Midwestern farmhouse built in the early 1900s. I had several experiences that convinced me that something spooky was most certainly happening there, but I'm still not sure what exactly that something is. One of my early memories is actually a fever hallucination from when I was about 4 years old. I remember laying on the couch in our living room and seeing these medium-sized gnomes/trolls dance around. They were maybe 1 to 2 feet tall. I wasn't scared of them, as we had figurines similar to them around our house, sent by my dad's family from Denmark. I remember knowing they were related because they wore the same hats. In the next year or two, I had a summer where at night, outside of my 2nd-story window, I saw what I described as an evil koala and scary gorilla. They both seemed to have dark fur that stood out around their faces and deep-set red eyes. They would press their face close enough to the window that the little bit of light from my bedside lamp would catch their red eyes, and I could see the outline of their shape because they were darker than the night sky. They always appeared together, as far as I can remember. My family did some things, knowingly or not, to kind of keep the peace with our genius loci. A genius loci, by the way, is a protective guardian or spirit of a particular place. Probably the best example is how we celebrated the winter holidays. Christmas was a time when we focused on Danish traditions on our farm. While my classmates were leaving milk and cookies out for Santa, we were leaving out a bowl of Riz Alamande. I know I didn't say that right. For the jewel Nisi. If you try sounding those out, you might guess that the main ingredients of Riz Alamande are rice and slivered almonds, which are mixed into freshly whipped cream and served with warm cherry pie filling. And we were leaving it out for the Yule elf. The bowl was always licked clean in the morning. I'm really grateful to have grown up in such a magical, spooky place. Okay, that was quite a story. So the story is called Farm Goblins. I wonder if there's one of these creatures in particular that they're referring to, maybe the creepy creatures in the window, or maybe just all of them. Because goblins can just mean, mischievous little beings, right? So let's talk about a couple things here. First, the gnomes that they saw when they had a fever, which we could just put down to having a fever, of course. Either way, these gnomes that they say they have figurines in their house from Denmark, these are called nisse, and they look pretty much like what we imagine garden gnomes to look like. And they kind of act like brownies. So nisse kind of inhabit your home, usually farms, and they will do chores for you, and they will look after your livestock and kind of help out as long as you treat them well. And they especially like to get bowls of cream and milk and stuff like that. They mention this term later, genius loci, or Loki, I'm not sure how to say that, but it's Latin. And that is a term that comes from ancient Rome, which means, like a protective spirit of a particular area. Nisse are definitely fall into that category. And as far as the jewel Nisse, that is the Danish version of Santa Claus. The Santa Claus, the Yule elf, he has little Nisse with him, and they pass out presents, or the coal, if you've been bad, in exchange for a bowl of cream, or Riz Alamande, I guess. No, I'm not saying that right. Farm Goblins. That's a very cool story. I like it. Who's to say that there aren't gnomes in Illinois? Okay, next we're going to go to Minnesota as we read Phantom Music. And I'm going to drop you into these beautiful Minnesota forests. The date for this one is September 23rd, 2019. In 2019, I decided to make an offering to the local spirits in the woods on the afternoon of the autumn equinox. I followed the Superior hiking trail from the Munger Trailhead on Beck's Road toward Fond du Lac. I'm not entirely sure how far I went out, but it was well past the Miller Creek Bridge. I just kept hiking until it felt right, then walked a ways off the trail to a little clearing on the hill. From where I sat, I could see a bend of the trail, so I could see whether anyone came or went. About halfway through my offering, I suddenly heard very nearby what sounded like a wooden flute. It only played a short melody, which did not repeat and did not continue into a full song. That was it. I heard nothing further. No one else came or went along the trail the whole time I was there. I never saw anyone. But what was very interesting to me was that on the whole way back, the woods smelled like incense and looked absolutely golden. I'm convinced I had an encounter with the other crowd that day. That's the end of the story, and the other crowd is, of course, a term for the fairies. So fairies are very fond of music, and they've been known to play fiddles, harps, flutes, of course, drums. I wanted to read a couple passages to you from some of my favorite go-to books on fairy lore about fairy music. One of them in particular is going to be very interesting in relation to this story. The first little excerpt I want to read you is from Fairies, which is written and illustrated by Brian Froud and Alan Lee. Brian Froud you probably know from designing the characters for films like Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal, and Alan Lee has done a ton of illustrations for Lord of the Rings and other Tolkien books. So, Brian Froud writes, "Fairies are passionately fond of music. Fairy melodies are known to be beautiful and plaintive, yet wild and capricious, and they have a fatal charm for mortal ears. A wistful fairy air may lull the listener into a fatal sleep, while at best he might become drawn into a melancholic forgetfulness, hearing forever the vague, yearning music, a constant reminder of the unattainable." Luckily, it doesn't sound like that happened to our writer. Alright, I'm going to read another snippet from a book called British Goblins: Welsh Folklore, Fairy Mythology, Legends, and Traditions by Wirt Sykes. It says, "The music of the fairies has been variously described by people who claim to have heard it, but as a rule, with much vagueness, as of a sweet, intangible harmony. One Morgan Gwillem, who saw the fairies by Silepsta waterfall and heard their music dying away, was only able to recall the last strain, which he said sounded something like this." So yes, when we read that story, I immediately thought of this, because our author said that he could only hear a short little snippet, a little melody, and that was it, and then it died away. And that seems to be very common for fairy music. You only get to hear a little bit, and it can be quite hard to recall or recreate. I remember once when I was a kid, so one day I was outside and I heard music. It sounded like a band, like a garage band, practicing. I was probably, 10 or something at the time. For some reason, when I heard this, I felt compelled to find the source. It's not like it was really good music or anything. I don't know. I just really felt curious and drawn to find where it was coming from. So I started weaving through my neighborhood, and then I went down the road, and I kept feeling like I was just about to find it. But I never did. And I actually ended up walking about a half a mile away from my house without even realizing it. I just kept feeling like I'm about to find it. I have to keep going. And I don't know. Could have been some, some trick of acoustics, but it still kind of had that quality of fairy music to me, where I was lured farther and farther away trying to find it. All right, here's a short one. Takes place in Virginia, and it's called Phantom Manor. The time of the story was approximately 1983 to 1984. I was young, maybe 5 or 6, and I remember climbing the chain link fence in the backyard, between my yard and our neighbors. They had a dog I liked to watch. Only that day, it wasn't their yard on the other side of the fence, but someplace else. There were topiaries, vast gardens, and somewhere in the far distance, a large castle or manor house. Also, the light was different. It was afternoon in my backyard, but clearly late evening over there. Fireflies were coming out. And that's the end of the story. I wish we knew a little bit more. Did they get to explore this other place at all, or how did they get back to their backyard? I want to know more. That sounds incredible. I think that's all we're going to read tonight. I really had a good time looking through this website. I definitely want to pick around and hear more. So in the future, we will probably look under some of the other topics. High weirdness sounds very intriguing to me. Mythologies, of course. Love a classic UFO and a straight-up ghost. Maybe we'll even explore the actual map. Thank you guys so much for joining me tonight. I hope your evening is full of strangeness and magic. Until next time.